Welcome to the ADF Insider Essentials series, which demonstrates the essential skills, tips, tricks and techniques that you will require for building ADF applications. In this demonstration you will see how to handle the ADF dialog, OK and cancel buttons. My name is Frank Nymphius and I'm from the Oracle JDeveloper and ADF product management team. What you should know about ADF dialogs. So an ADF dialog is one of the child components that you can put inside of an AF pop-up dialog. So the AF pop-up is the functionality that you see when you launch a pop-up, but the Chrome, the rendering, is a dialog, a note window or something similar. So when you choose a dialog, then you get a nice little window-like dialog shown with a close icon, a text in the title and a choice of buttons that could be OK, cancel as we see in the screenshot, or just yes, no. When you press a button or you close the dialog, then there's an event published. Events that are published to the server include those of pressing the OK, yes or no button. However, if you press the close icon or the cancel button, this event must be handled on the client, and there it has to be handled in JavaScript. Now here's the challenge. You have a dialog and the user can either press OK or cancel. If they press OK, you want to commit a change to the database. Some data entry happened in the dialog, so you want to commit the change. But if you click cancel, then what you want to do is you want to undo everything that has been done before and what the user has typed into the dialog. Since this is on the client side, you have to find a way to move the event from the client to the server. So let's have a look. So here's a little use case that I want to use to illustrate what I want to achieve with the cancel and the OK button in the dialog. First of all, I just make a row the current selected row. So this is now synchronized to the binding layer, so the binding layer knows exactly that department 60 is the current selected row. So when I click the create new row button, what happens is on the server side there's a new row being created and added to the transaction, which I can tell because the new row gets added to the table. And then a dialog pops up, and in this dialog I can edit data. So I can put in a new department. So as a user now, if I press OK, then the change will be committed to the database, so a new row will be created and is available in the database. But in this case I want to press cancel, and what I want it to happen and to do is that it undoes the creation of the row, but it should also clean that form for me. So I press cancel and see what happens to the current selected row in the table. Currently the new row is the current selected row. I want it to be set back to department 60. Press cancel and department 60 is now the current row. So it's completely rolling back without really calling rollback on the transaction. And this is what I needed to do by dispatching the event that happens on the client. And note that I said that the cancel event is something that you have to listen for on the client in JavaScript, and then you call back to the server, which in this case I did just to notify the server that the current row should be deleted, and of course the dialog should be clean, so the next time I press create new row it doesn't come up with predefined values and preset values. So let's have a look how this is implemented. What I prepared is a page, an ADF Faces page, that I dragged the all departments view object as a table onto it. Then I chose the command button from the component palette and dragged this in to become my create new button, which actually is supposed to create the new row in the ADF iterator, but also to launch the pop-up. So the next step is that we need to create the pop-up. So for this I choose the pop-up component. It's in the component panel, it's under the common components, and I drag this onto my page. I can do this either into the visual editor or in the structure window, and it immediately shows in the visual editor. The dialog is a child of the pop-up, so I browse for the dialog in my component panel, and then I drag the dialog into the pop-up. Now as we see, the default is the OK and cancel option and the close icon. This is configurable using the property inspector. To create the form, to edit the new row I created, I just drag the view object again into the dialog, and the binding layer will make sure that whatever is selected as a current row in the table is also shown as a current row in the input form. So I choose ADF form. Because I commit the data when I press OK in the dialog and I roll back the data changes when I press cancel, I don't need the dialog to have, or the form to have, a navigation control or a submit button, so I can straight away click OK. Next step is, at runtime I need to have access to the pop-up and to the table. I need to have access to the pop-up instance just to open it up, and I need to have access to the table to partially refresh it at the end. So for this I use a managed bean. So I select the AF pop-up component, go to the property inspector, and every component has a binding property, and this binding property can point to a method in a managed bean. Now in my case I don't have a managed bean created, so first I need to create one, and this dialog allows me to do so. So I'm pressing new, and then I call it create department page helper. And if I keep this checkbox selected, then if the bean doesn't exist, it will be created for me, which is exactly what I want. The default code is request. That's also fine with me. So the pop-up actually should be referenced by the property name of pop-up. This is only because I only have one pop-up in my page, so I'm not getting confused by only calling it pop-up. So it creates the managed bean and it creates a pop-up reference. Now I go to my table, and on my table again I search for the binding property, and this binding property allows me now to create a table entry. This time I have my managed bean created, so I don't need to recreate it. Let's call it the departments table. Just to get a handle to the table. So saving it up. And there's a bit more that I need the pop-up to do for me. First of all, what it needs to do is it needs to launch the dialog. But before we configure the dialog opening in Java, let's provide some functionality to the create new button. So far the create new button only has a partial submit property set to true, which is required because when I press the submit button or the create new button, I want it to open a light white dialog, which it can only do if it's not refreshing the whole page. And for that reason you have to set it in the property inspector partial submit to true. The view object has an operation called create insert, which will create a new row once it's invoked, when it's called. So to call it from a button, I just take it from here and drag and drop this on top of a button. Of course I can directly drop it as a button as well, but since I have a button created already, I just put it on top of the existing button, and this now allows me to rebind the functionality of that button. So I want to keep with my button label, and I want to keep it enabled all the time. So when for this button I now switch to the property inspector, what we see is that the action listener now points to the binding layer to invoke the create insert operation whenever I press the button. However, I need the button to also launch the dialog. For this I need Java. I could use the show pop-up behavior, as many of you know. The only problem is that the show pop-up behavior will cancel any following actions. So this has an action listener defined. If I use the show pop-up behavior to open the pop-up, it will cancel the action event, which means I'm not getting to execute the create insert operation. For that reason, I need to have a managed bean. So what I can do is I can double click on this command button, select create department page helper, give the action a name. In my case I just stick with the name I have, and make sure that the Generate ADF Binding Code checkbox is selected, because this now will make sure that the default functionality of this button will be copied over to the Managed Bean code. So the create insert functionality would still be there. So now I can look into how to implement my dialog events. And there are two events I'm interested in listening for. One is the OK event, in which case I want to commit, and the other one is the cancel event, in which case I want to delete the newly created row. So for the commit, that's fairly easy. So I go to the bindings tab here, and then on the binding I press the plus for the new binding. I choose an action binding, and on the application module, on the data control, there is a commit operation and a rollback operation. I choose the commit operation, and this doesn't yet create a component on my page, but it provides the functionality in the binding layer in the page definition file, which then I can call from Java. So what I want is that if a user presses OK, I want to call out to my binding layer to execute that functionality. So this was just an intermediate step that we needed to do. So next step is really to go to my pop-up dialog, and this dialog has a dialog listener. So, and for this listener, which we see here, the dialog listener, I want to create an event handler in my Managed Bean. So here's my Managed Bean, and then I can create the pop-up handler. So let's call it on dialog action. Dialog action. So whenever there's an event coming from the dialog, I want to listen to that. And we know that we can listen for the OK event, the yes event, no event, but close events and cancel event has to be handled on the client side. So actually we separate the two use cases here. First go with the commit event. So when I do this, when I create the dialog handler, then I get an entry in my Managed Bean, and this entry is as a name I gave to the action handler, and it passes in an object of type dialog event. From this dialog event object, I can get the information about what is it exactly that the user pressed. So there's an inner class which is available on the dialog event object, and this inner class is called outcome. The dialog event object that gets passed into my class also has a dialog event, and there I can call get outcome. So this gives me the user's choice. So how did the user close the dialog? This is what I get from the outcome. And now I'm interested in if the user pressed the OK button. So I could say if outcome equals, and then we can go to dialog event, and then there's an outcome OK. So whenever the user pressed the OK button, I'm getting right into here, and here I can fill in the code to access the binding layer to perform the commit operation, which basically is the same code, or pretty much the same code as here. So bindings, get bindings, operation binding, and instead of create insert, I would just put in commit here. Yeah? And then I just execute the commit operation when the OK is pressed. I will show you that later, so I will just do a bit different work now, because this now handles the case where the user OKs the dialog. So we need to handle the case where the user doesn't OK the dialog, but where the user actually presses cancel. And for this we need to listen for the dialog's cancel event, which in fact again is a dialog event just listened for on the client. So we go to our component palette, and to listen for client-side events there's a client listener tag, and this client listener tag allows us to use JavaScript to specify JavaScript that gets called in response to a specific event that happens on an ADF component. In the dialog case, it's again a dialog event. It's just of type ADF event, so it's not a rich component event, it's a client-side JavaScript event that we use for that. And so let's have a look how we can create this, and this we create by just dragging the client listener onto the dialog, releasing the mouse, and then we can specify a method which is the name of the JavaScript that we want to create. So let's call this on dialog action, and then the type is dialog. So whenever now there's something that happens on the dialog on the client side, the JavaScript method gets called. So next step for us is to implement that method, and for this we need to add JavaScript to our page or reference it from the page, which is what we use the resource tag for. The resource tag sits under the operations canvas in the accordion of the component panel. So just drag and drop this in, and one thing you need to make sure for the resource tag is it has to be a part, or actually a member, a direct child of the document, of AF document. So it wants to be set to either Starsheet or JavaScript. In our case it's JavaScript. We OK this, just verifying that it's directly under the document. So in this case we just misplaced it to move it up here under the AF document. So first child of the document. This can also be used to reference JavaScript in an external file, which I recommend you doing for any piece of reusable JavaScript in your application. And now we build a JavaScript function on dialog action, just passing an argument in. That's what the framework is injecting to this functionality, and what you will get is a type ADF dialog event. And this ADF dialog event allows you to first of all get access to what is the source, which dialog received that event or issued that event, and then you can use this information now to detect if it's a cancel button pressed, because it will also be called for the OK button and for the yes no button. So you want to check if the cancel button was pressed. And now what we want to do is we want to call the server, and to call the server there's another tag that is called the server listener, and the server listener again sits here in the operations panel, and I just drag and drop this again onto the page. The type that it asks for is just a name, yeah. So so let's call it dialog action event handler, because that is what I wanted to do, to handle the dialog action event handler. Okay, so just move it next to the client listener, so they are next to each other. And now the client listener can call the server listener by just queuing a custom event. A custom event is an object, ADF custom event, and this ADF custom event, when called, fires the functionality that is associated with the server listener. And you see when I select the server listener in the property inspector, there's a method property, and this method property allows me to link the functionality of the server listener with the manage_bean method. And again I choose my manage_bean and I create a new method on action cancel And this now creates a new method in the manage bean, which we see here, and it allows us to receive an object. So just in case there's a payload, if the JavaScript function wants to tell me a bit more than just that yes, there's a dialog event, then it could also pass a payload, which could be a key value pair, giving me more detailed information that I can handle with. Now, and this here actually is now what I would use to undo everything that has happened before the user pressed cancel. So let's do a fast forward, and I go offline for a second and then continue showing you the fully implemented example. Okay, so here I'm back again. Let's start looking at the implementation of the JavaScript code. The JavaScript code, which I added to the page here, it's on dialog cancel. First of all, we're checking the outcome, and it's again the same code we would use on the server side. And if the outcome is outcome cancel, as you can see here, then we want to send that information to the server, and this is what we use the ADF custom event for. ADF custom event queue, it queues the dialog cancel handle event, which we created before as a server listener. We don't need to pass a payload because we just want to inform the server that something has happened, there's a cancel event happening, and we send it as an immediate event because we want to bypass a lifecycle. We want to avoid that pressing the cancel button will cause a submit of the newly created row to the ADF binding layer. So we want to bypass a lifecycle, so that means that by setting it to immediate, this command gets executed, and then we do everything we need to do to undo what the user did so far. So this notifies the server. So in JavaScript, I check the event of this dialog. I recognize it's a cancel dialog operation, and for this reason I pass in an event notifying the server. This is the real Ajax thing we're doing here. So whenever you thought about how to use an XML HTTP request to the server in ADFFaces, this is it. This is exactly how you do it. Yeah, so don't try playing yourself with the XML HTTP request object. It's all wrapped within ADFFaces, and that's the wrapper, ADF custom event. Alright, so let's close this one and go to the managed bean. So first of all, we're interested in how actually do we handle the close event in response to cancel. So on dialog cancel, here's a client event that gets in. I'll get access to my ADF binding layer, and then I use the rich pop-up reference that I created using the binding property on the pop-up dialog to get access to the pop-up, and I call hide on the pop-up. So pop-up hide. This closes the dialog, as we could see in the demo before. Then I get access to the iterator. And the current row of the iterator actually is the newly created row. In this case I call remove current row, so you can see this is not even required, so I can get rid of that one. So I remove the current row, then I use the ADF context, and what I want to do is, because I saved away the information about what was the current row before I created a new row into a viewScope attribute, and this viewScope attribute is accessed through the ADF context, get viewScope, and then the attribute name. And what I do here is I set the current row back to the row key that I saved up in my viewScope. So this is how I set back the default behavior. And then I call ADFFaces get current instance at partial target, and I refresh the table so that the table shows the refreshed information. That's all that I needed to do. So let's have a look at some other implementation code in here. So here's my OK dialog handling. So I check outcome OK, and if this is the case, I just call an operation binding. Bindings get operation binding commit, which I created using the binding panel. I'm not listening for the results, so here's where you really want to check for errors, and if there are errors you want to handle those errors. In my case, I just let the commit operation do the work, and then I call add partial target and refresh the table. Further up here, I implemented the action event. Now this is when you press the create new row button. It gets access to the binding. First thing it does, it gets access to the current row in the iterator, gets access to the view scope through the ADF context, and now what it does is it gets the row key of the current row and writes it to the view scope. And later on, when we cancel the event, then we set this information back to become the current row. So the old row then will be sent back. That is just to handle the cancel event. Then we call create insert. This will create the new row in the transaction. And then I call rich popup, get access to the pop-up dialog. I have no pop-up hints because I want the dialog to open in the center of the page. If you want to align this to some other component, then you would call this with pop-up hints, like a line ID for the component that you want to reference in the layout or in the alignment, and where exactly in relation to that component you want to have the pop-up to display. And then I just call pop-up show hints, and this opens up the dialog, and then the user can work with that. And that's all that it takes. The rest is generated code. Here's my key that I specified where in the view scope I want to have this to be saved. To summarize this ADF Insider Essential session, the ADF dialog provides you with the option to close the dialog with OK, cancel, yes or no as a button. Only the OK, yes or no buttons are automatically propagated to the server. So unless you're canceling them on the client by just suppressing the event, these three buttons will send an invocation to the server, and then as shown for the OK button in the managed bean, you can respond to that. The cancel button or the close operation on the dialog, however, only happen on the client. These are client-side event only. In this session I showed you how you can use a client listener and a server listener to listen for the cancel event and to send a notification to the server so that the server can then, in our use case, undo the row creation or whatever you need to do on the server. So there's a way to make the cancel event aware to the server. The sample that I used in this session is available as sample 77 on ADF Code Corner. ADF Code Corner provides you a written document explaining how things work and why they work, and also the sample that I showed in this session. So it was a lot of code, I admit, and for sure building the sample is shorter than teaching the sample. If you want to learn more, you're invited to go to the Oracle JDeveloper homepage on OTN or oracle.com/technology/JDev. You can find downloads for the tools, for the samples, tutorials, access to the discussion forums, and you find access to the ADF developer guides and a lot more information around the Oracle ADF and Oracle JDeveloper technology. Thanks for watching.